Hi, I'm Robert, and today I'm going to tell you the story of Nikola Tesla through his own eyes. I came into the world at midnight on the 10th of July, 1856, in a small stone house in Smiljan, in the mountains of what was then the Austrian Empire, the region you now call Croatia. Lightning split the sky that night, so violently that the midwife, crossing herself, told my mother I would be a child of the storm, a bringer of misfortune. My mother, Juka, exhausted but unshaken, corrected her on the spot. "No," she said, "he will be a child of light." I have never been able to decide, across the whole of my life, which of the two women was right. My father, Milutin, was an Orthodox priest who wanted me to follow him into the church. My mother had never spent a day in school, yet she could recite entire epic poems from memory and built her own tools and household devices by hand. Whatever gift I had for invention, I did not get from books. I got it from her. Long before I understood electricity, I understood water. As a boy in the countryside around Smiljan, I built a small wheel and set it turning in a stream near our house, smooth, without paddles, unlike any water wheel I had seen drawn in books. It ran for hours, spinning on the current, and I remember standing over it, transfixed, long after the other children had lost interest and gone home. I did not know yet that I had built a rudimentary turbine. I only knew that I had made something that moved on its own, powered by nothing but the shape I had given it and the water that was already there. Looking back, I think that stream taught me the lesson that shaped my entire career, that the forces already surrounding us, water, magnetism, the current, and the air itself, are waiting to be organized, not invented from nothing. In 1875, I enrolled at the Polytechnic in Graz, and it was there in a physics lecture that my professor demonstrated a Graham dynamo, a machine that could run as a generator or reversed as a motor. It worked, but its commutators sparked and sputtered with every rotation, throwing off heat and wasted current. I asked, in front of the whole class, whether the sparking brushes could simply be removed. My professor, a man named Poschel, told me plainly that what I was describing was impossible, the equivalent, he said, of a perpetual motion machine. He was a good teacher and not a cruel man, but he was certain, and his certainty planted something stubborn in me. I did not have an answer for him that day, but I could not let the question go. For the next 7 years in lecture halls, in workshops, and eventually in a park in Budapest, some part of my mind never stopped turning that motor over, looking for the flaw in his logic rather than in mine. By February of 1882, I was living in Budapest, working long hours at the Central Telephone Exchange, and I had pushed myself to the edge of a breakdown. My senses had become so heightened I could hear a watch ticking through 3 rooms. My friend Anthony Sigety, worried for me, insisted we walk together in the city park in the evenings until I recovered. On one of those walks at sunset, I was reciting lines from Goethe's Faust when it happened. Not gradually, but all at once like a curtain pulled back. I saw, complete and moving, a rotating magnetic field. 2 or more alternating currents, out of phase with one another, that could spin a motor's rotor without any commutator, without a single spark. I stopped walking. I believe I frightened Anthony. He told me later I looked as though I had seen something not of this world. I took a stick and drew the whole system in the dirt of the path, right there, before the vision could fade. Everything I built for the rest of my life, in one sense, was just an engineer's patient translation of those few minutes in that park. I did not have the money or the workshop to build it in Budapest. So I did what an engineer without capital has always had to do. I took a job, first with the Continental Edison Company in Paris, and then at one of their power stations in Strasbourg, repairing a faulty installation. In whatever hours I had left at night, in a rented workshop, I built the first crude model of my induction motor with my own hands, piece by piece, out of scavenged parts. It sparked less than the dynamo I'd seen in Graz. It did not work perfectly, not yet, but it turned driven by nothing but the phase-shifted currents I had imagined in the park. I remember staring at it running on the bench and thinking Poschel was wrong, and I am the only man alive who knows it. In 1884, I sailed for America with 4 cents in my pocket and a letter of introduction to Thomas Edison, written by one of his own engineers, which read, "I know 2 great men, and you are one of them. This young man is the other." Edison hired me on the spot to redesign the DC dynamos in his machine works, and I threw myself into it, working nights, sometimes not sleeping at all. When I finished, dramatically improving their efficiency, I reminded him of what I understood to be his promise, $50,000 if I succeeded. He laughed, that particular laugh of his, and told me I simply didn't understand American humor. I kept working for him a while longer, immaculate in my dress, even on a factory floor thick with oil and soot. The men used to joke that I was the only person in the building who never seemed to get dirty. But a debt unpaid is a debt unpaid. In 1885, I resigned, and for a time after that I dug ditches for $2 a day to survive, which is not the sentence anyone expects to find in the biography of an inventor, but it is the truth. By 1887, I had found new investors willing to bet on an idea instead of a reputation, and together we formed the Tesla Electric Company. I built, at last, a full working model of the alternating current induction motor, the machine I had first seen whole in a Budapest park 5 years earlier. When I switched it on in front of my new partners, it turned smoothly, powerfully, and without a single spark at the brushes because there were no brushes left to spark. I watched their faces as much as I watched the motor. That quiet, contained hum was the sound of Professor Poschel being wrong, of a boy stream-powered while growing up, of every argument I'd lost finally being won in the one place that mattered, in the metal itself. I licensed my patents to George Westinghouse in 1888, and together we spent years in what the newspapers came to call the War of Currents. Edison's side ran a public campaign against alternating current, even electrocuting animals to frighten the public into believing it was inherently more dangerous than his direct current. The argument was won not in a courtroom, but in Chicago in 1893, when the world's Columbian Exposition needed to light an entire fairground in Westinghouse, and I underbid Edison's company to do it. On opening night, I stood at the switch myself in front of a crowd of thousands, and when I closed it, nearly 100,000 lamps came alive across the fairgrounds at once, what the papers called the White City. I remember the sound the crowd made. Not quite a cheer, more like a single collective breath being let out, as if the whole country had been holding it. At that same fair, and in lectures for years afterward, I liked to demonstrate something that unsettled even scientists. I would pass hundreds of thousands of volts of high-frequency current through my own body, carefully tuned so that it rode along my skin rather than through my organs, and hold up a vacuum bulb with no wires attached to it at all. It would glow, powered by nothing visibly connecting it to anything. People gasped. Some thought it was a trick. It was not a trick. It was a preview of the world I actually wanted to build, one where power itself moved invisibly through the air the way I believed information someday would too. In 1899, I built an experimental station in Colorado Springs, far from the city, where I could work at a scale no laboratory in New York would ever have permitted. There, I generated artificial lightning, bolts I measured at over 100 feet long, loud enough to be heard 15 miles away, bright enough to be seen from the next town. I was testing the Earth itself as a conductor, trying to learn whether I could transmit not just a signal, but real, usable power without a single wire to any point on the globe. Late one night, monitoring my receivers, I recorded a rhythmic pattern of static I could not explain by any terrestrial source I knew of. I wondered, perhaps too publicly, whether I had heard something from another world. I was likely wrong about the source. I was not wrong about the ambition behind the question. I returned to New York convinced that Colorado Springs was only a rehearsal, and in 1901 I began building the real instrument on Long Island. a tower nearly 200 feet tall, at a site I called Wardenclyffe. J.P. Morgan financed the first stage of it, though I suspect what he was funding and what I was building were never quite the same project in either of our minds. He believed he was buying a transatlantic wireless telegraph, a rival to cable and to Marconi. I was building the beginning of a system to send both messages and electrical power itself, freely, to every corner of the earth. I stood beneath that tower some evenings just to look up at it, at the copper dome that was meant to gather and hurl a current around the whole curve of the planet, and I believed entirely that I was standing at the edge of the future. Then, in December of 1901, Marconi transmitted a signal across the Atlantic with far simpler equipment than mine. To the public, it looked as though he had already won the race I thought I was running. Morgan's confidence did not collapse all at once. But I remember a conversation on the grounds at Wardenclyffe when I first understood he had stopped listening to my larger ambition and was only ever going to pay for the smaller one. I tried, more than once, to explain what free, wireless power would actually mean for the world. I watched him turn away from me, not in anger, simply in the particular finality of a man closing a ledger. By 1904, the money had stopped entirely. The tower stood unfinished and useless for over a decade, until 1917, when it was seized and dynamited for scrap to cover debts I no longer had the means to pay. I will not pretend that moment did not break something in me. It did. The years afterward were not kind, and I will not dress them up as though they were. I moved from hotel to hotel in New York as my debts caught up with me, sometimes leaving unpaid bills behind me like a trail. I kept working, sketches for turbines, for wireless transmission, for ideas most engineers of my generation considered fantasy. But the world had largely stopped funding a man it had already decided was finished. I became, by most accounts, difficult, fastidious to the point of illness about germs, fixated on the number 3, spending long nights alone at a desk buried under papers that fewer and fewer people were willing to read. I told myself the isolation was a condition of a work. Some nights, staring out over a city I'd helped to light, I was no longer sure that was true. In those last years, my closest companions were not investors or engineers, but the pigeons I fed in the parks near my hotel. There was one white pigeon in particular I came to love, and I use that word deliberately, the way a man loves a woman. A bird I nursed and fed by hand in my window for years. When she died, I told a friend that something in me had died with her, and I do not think I was exaggerating for effect. I died alone on the 7th of January, 1943, in a room at the Hotel New Yorker, found 2 days later by a maid who had ignored the "Do Not Disturb" sign on my door. I left no fortune. I left boxes of unpublished notebooks the government quietly took an interest in. Only months after my death, the United States Supreme Court overturned Marconi's radio patent and recognized that the underlying invention had been mine first, a small, late justice. And in 1960, long after anyone could still argue with me about it, they gave my name to a unit of measurement, the Tesla, the strength of a magnetic field. I did not build my life to be remembered in a unit of measurement. But I have come to think there are worse monuments than a number that never stops being used quietly in laboratories all over the world that outlived me. That was the story of Nikola Tesla, in his own words. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe for more stories like this one. And let me know in the comments, which historical figure do you want to see next?